The night sky over Long Island was quiet. At 8:31 p.m., a bright flash tore through the darkness. Witnesses saw what looked like a streak of fire, climbing, then falling toward the Atlantic. Moments later, a thunderous explosion split the summer air. Transworld Airlines Flight 800, a Boeing 747 bound for Paris, had vanished from radar just 12 minutes after takeoff. 230 lives gone in an instant. Within seconds, the world's most advanced passenger jet became a falling constellation of fire, plunging into the sea. For years, that flash would haunt America. What happened inside that plane? A bomb? A missile? Or something buried deep within the aircraft itself? This is the story of how one explosion changed aviation forever. Like, share, and subscribe for more real crash investigations. The last light of day was fading over New York's South Shore when the passengers of Transworld Airlines Flight 800 began to settle in for a routine night across the Atlantic. The Boeing 747 sat at Gate 27 of JFK Airport, bathed in the orange glow of ramp lights, its four massive engines quiet for now. Families returning to Europe, students on exchange, couples on honeymoon, all unaware that they had already entered history. It was July 17, 1996. The air was thick, the heat of the day lingering over the tarmac. Mechanics moved across the ramp, loading cargo and catering trucks, while the flight crew completed final checks. Captain Ralph Kevorkian, a seasoned pilot with over 18,000 hours, reviewed his flight plan. His first officer and flight engineer cross-checked fuel, altitude, and weather data. Nothing appeared unusual. Inside the cabin, 230 passengers settled in. Some took Polaroids of the sunset outside their windows. Others opened books or leaned against their seatbacks, already drifting toward sleep. The smell of coffee and jet fuel mingled faintly as the cabin crew moved through the aisles with easy smiles. The 747, christened Clipper Maid of the Seas, had carried thousands safely before, and tonight it would lift off into a clear, moonless sky bound for Paris. At 8:19 p.m., the aircraft taxied from the gate and joined a long line of departing flights along runway 22R. On the flight deck, radio chatter filled the headsets. TWA 800, your number 5 for departure. The engines roared to life, trembling through the cabin floor as the aircraft began its slow roll down the runway. At 8:31 p.m., clearance came through. TWA 800 cleared for takeoff. The jet accelerated, nose lifting against the humid summer air. Moments later, the Boeing climbed steadily past 10,000 feet, turning east over the coastline. Below, fishermen near Moriches Inlet looked up. They saw a faint glimmer against the twilight horizon, a silver shape climbing higher, its navigation lights twinkling faintly against the purple haze of dusk. Then, seconds later, came the flash. Witnesses would later describe it in dozens of ways. Some saw a rising streak, others a ball of light. Some swore it climbed before exploding. But all agreed on one thing: the sky erupted without warning. At 8:31 and 12 seconds, radar recorded a sudden split in the aircraft's trace. The transponder signal vanished. Air traffic controllers at New York Center, watching their scopes, assumed it was a transponder glitch. They called, TWA 800, climb and maintain 15,000. Silence. No acknowledgement. No mayday. Nothing but static. In those same seconds, at 13,700 feet above the Atlantic, something catastrophic happened inside the aircraft's center fuel tank. A blast so sudden, so violent, that the front section of the fuselage tore away instantly. The cockpit separated from the rest of the plane, breaking into pieces as fire engulfed the wings. The passengers, most, never knew what happened. Debris began raining into the ocean, streaks of burning fuel trailing like falling stars. The roar of the explosion echoed across the quiet shoreline. Within minutes, calls flooded emergency dispatchers. "There's something on fire out at sea. A plane's gone down." The Coast Guard launched immediately. Helicopters lifted from Long Island airfields, their searchlights sweeping the black surface of the Atlantic. Rescue boats raced toward the coordinates, but what they found was chaos. Flaming wreckage spread across miles, seat cushions and life jackets drifting among burning debris. The smell of fuel hung heavy on the waves. By 10 p.m., the first recovery crews arrived at the scene. Divers entered the dark water, guided only by handheld lamps and radio beacons. What they found was devastation. Sections of fuselage scattered in pieces, a wing lying inverted on the ocean floor. The heat of the explosion had twisted aluminum like paper. Within hours, the grim task began. Bodies were brought ashore to makeshift morgues along the Long Island coast. Families began arriving at airports, faces pale, waiting for news that would never come. For America, this was more than another tragedy. The country had lived through the Oklahoma City bombing just a year earlier, and the word terrorism spread instantly. Eyewitnesses claimed they saw a streak of light rise toward the aircraft before the blast. Some said it looked like a missile. The media ran with the possibility. Headlines screamed of "attack on Flight 800." Theories multiplied before sunrise. But in the debris fields, investigators from the NTSB and FBI faced a reality far more complicated than rumor. The wreckage told no clear story. Some parts were burned, others cleanly torn. No immediate trace of explosives, no shrapnel pattern consistent with a warhead. Still, pressure mounted from every direction. Politicians demanded answers, families demanded truth, and television anchors demanded explanation. The sun rose over a smoldering ocean as recovery ships began the most complex salvage operation in U.S. history. What no one yet realized was that the real culprit was hiding inside the wreckage, something invisible, silent, waiting to be discovered through thousands of hours of investigation.
The morning after the explosion, the Atlantic was calm, eerily calm, its surface dotted with orange buoys marking the last known position of Flight 800. Search vessels moved slowly across the water, dragging sonar arrays through the waves. The air smelled of fuel and salt, a reminder that just beneath lay one of the worst aviation disasters in U.S. history. The mission was simple in words, impossible in execution. Recover everything, every fragment, every life, every clue. Coast Guard cutters, Navy divers, and local fishermen worked side by side. Helicopters hovered low, scanning for survivors long after hope was gone. The wreckage stretched for miles. Suitcases, life vests, seat cushions, and twisted aluminum reflecting the morning sun. Some pieces were burned black, others were untouched, as though torn from the sky without warning. Divers descended into a world of silence, broken only by the crackle of their radios and the hum of engines above. On land, the media frenzy had begun. Reporters lined the beaches of Long Island, cameras aimed at the horizon. Theories were everywhere. Terrorists, sabotage, even an accidental missile test. Within hours, federal agents arrived. The FBI took charge, treating the site as a potential crime scene. Side by side, Agents and NTSB investigators waded into a conflict that would last years, one searching for suspects, the other for science. At Calverton, a massive hangar was transformed into a morgue and evidence lab. As body bags arrived, so did fragments of the aircraft, each tagged, cleaned, and logged. Investigators began the painstaking process of reconstruction. On one end of the hangar, technicians mounted twisted aluminum frames onto scaffolding, recreating the 747's fuselage, piece by piece. The image was both haunting and magnificent, a three-dimensional autopsy of a jetliner. Every rivet mattered. Each tear in the metal was photographed and mapped. Explosive experts examined suit patterns, searching for traces of TNT, PETN, or RDX. None appeared. No residue, no detonation signature, no warhead fragments. Yet witnesses insisted they had seen a streak rising toward the plane, hundreds of them. Military radar tapes showed a mysterious blip near the path of Flight 800. The FBI leaned toward a missile. The NTSB held back. In Washington, pressure mounted. President Clinton called for answers. News networks ran hour-long specials titled The Missile Theory. Former Navy officers were interviewed. Some claimed a Navy exercise might have misfired a missile. The Navy denied it outright, but doubt grew. Families, desperate for closure, clung to any explanation that made sense of the senseless. Meanwhile, in the hangar, engineers followed a different trail. They noticed something subtle. The pattern of fragmentation near the center fuel tank was inward, not outward. Instead of being punctured from outside, it seemed to have exploded from within. That observation changed everything. The Boeing 747's center wing tank, located beneath the cabin floor, was normally filled with jet fuel. On Flight 800, it was almost empty, containing only vapor. Investigators realized the conditions inside were perfect for ignition. Warm weather, residual heat from air conditioning packs, and lingering fumes. But what could ignite vapor without a spark plug or flame? They turned to wiring. Over the years, electrical cables in the 747's fuel quantity system had frayed, their insulation aging under vibration and heat. A single short circuit, just one arc of current, could bridge into the fuel sensor line. If that happened inside a vapor-filled tank, the result would be catastrophic. It was a theory built not on politics, but physics. By late 1996, two parallel investigations ran at full speed. The FBI scoured for terrorism links, interviewing passengers, tracking maintenance records, even testing residue on recovered luggage. Nothing. The NTSB, in contrast, built a narrative from data and debris. Flight data recorders revealed no sudden climb, no evasive maneuver, no radar lock. The cockpit voice recorder captured routine chatter, a brief center, TWA 800 climbing to 15,000, followed by a sudden cut. No explosion noise before the end, just silence. Months turned into years. Nearly 1.5 million pieces of wreckage were recovered from the sea floor. The reconstruction grew like a skeleton of metal and memory. Each piece numbered, connected, questioned. Engineers ran simulations, wiring tests, and explosion experiments. Every new result pointed toward a single, haunting conclusion. The blast came from inside the center tank. For the public, that answer felt unsatisfying. No villains, no missiles, no grand conspiracy, just a spark, a flaw, and a tragedy waiting to happen. But for investigators, truth wasn't about drama, it was about precision. The hardest part was proving it. In one of the final underwater recoveries, divers located a critical fragment, the left center wing beam. Its metal edges showed bending consistent with an internal pressure wave. Inside the beam were traces of soot, consistent with low-velocity fuel combustion. Forensic metallurgy confirmed what radar and rumor could not. There had been no missile. The explosion began where fuel should have been safe. As winter came to Long Island, the hangar stood as both memorial and puzzle. The reconstructed aircraft, suspended under bright floodlights, seemed almost whole again. Investigators could walk its aisles, trace the line of the blast, and imagine the final seconds. In those silent steps lay the answer that had eluded the world since that summer night. And yet, another question lingered. How could a commercial jet, designed with so many redundancies, tested for every imaginable hazard, ignite itself in midair? The answer would come not from the ocean, but from decades of overlooked maintenance records and one critical flaw buried deep in the jet's design.
As autumn settled over Long Island, the investigation into Flight 800 entered its most difficult phase, the long, slow grind between speculation and science. The hangar at Calverton had transformed into something almost sacred. Under bright industrial lamps, the partial skeleton of the Boeing 747 stood suspended above the floor, its torn metal glinting like a monument to lost lives. Technicians in white coveralls moved methodically between scaffolds, measuring, photographing, logging every rivet and burn mark. It was not just an airplane anymore. It was evidence, and each fragment carried a voice from that summer night. For months, the FBI had dominated headlines with talk of terrorism and missiles. But by late 1997, even they began to acknowledge that the physical evidence didn't fit the theory. No chemical residue, no shrapnel, no impact point. The missile hypothesis collapsed under the weight of data. And so the focus shifted to something smaller, quieter, almost invisible. Inside the aircraft's central structure, investigators had zeroed in on the center wing fuel tank, a cavity the size of a small room located directly beneath the first-class cabin. Engineers had seen the damage pattern before. Metal panels bowed outward. Rivet lines popped from internal pressure. It was the fingerprint of an internal explosion. But what could ignite a near-empty tank? Jet fuel doesn't explode easily. It requires the perfect balance of vapor, heat, and ignition. And yet, every simulation pointed the same way. Lead investigator Dr. Tom Houter of the NTSB pushed his team to examine the wiring harnesses routed near the tank. The 747's design dated back to the late 1960s, when insulation materials were less heat-resistant and age was not yet a concern. Over decades of service, vibration, humidity, and maintenance wear had taken their toll. Wires ran under floors, through conduits, across metal brackets, some frayed, others bare where insulation had rubbed away. One wire bundle leading to the fuel quantity indication system caught their attention. This system, designed to measure how much fuel remained, used low-voltage electrical signals running through sensors submerged in the tank. If one of those wires shorted, if a tiny arc of electricity jumped across a damaged section, it could ignite vapor inside the tank. On most flights, the tank would be full, leaving no space for fumes. But on Flight 800, the center tank was nearly empty, heated for hours by air conditioning packs mounted directly below. Inside that enclosed space, a dangerous mix had formed. The hypothesis began to solidify: a short circuit, a spark, and an explosion from within. Still, it was a theory that demanded proof. Engineers at the NTSB's laboratory in Washington conducted controlled tests, replicating the 747's fuel system. They filled tanks with Jet A fuel vapor, then ran electric currents through aged wiring bundles. It didn't take much. A brief arc, invisible to the naked eye, was enough to trigger a violent flash. The explosion ripped open the test tank's panels almost exactly as the real wreckage showed. While engineers worked in labs, others reconstructed the timeline second by second. The flight recorders revealed nothing alarming before the end, no sudden maneuvers, no warnings, no signs of attack. The cockpit voice recorder captured calm professionalism. Altitude calls, handovers, a discussion about the weather. Then silence. The last sound was a sharp electrical pop, lasting less than a quarter of a second. It matched perfectly with a short-circuit signature. But outside the hangar, not everyone was ready to accept that explanation. Families of the victims, tired of conflicting reports, felt the government was hiding the truth. Conspiracy theories exploded across the internet. Radio hosts, self-proclaimed experts, even retired military officers insisted that Flight 800 had been shot down accidentally by a Navy missile during training. Books and documentaries argued over witness statements, radar anomalies, and classified data. For many, the idea of an invisible wiring flaw seemed too small, too mundane to explain such horror. The investigators pressed on, undistracted by noise. They focused on the tangible, the physical scars inside the wreckage. Metallurgists studied the direction of bending on the fuselage skin. Chemical tests detected traces of fuel combustion, not explosives. Thermographic analysis revealed heat signatures consistent with a fuel-air explosion, not a high-explosive detonation. Piece by piece, the airplane itself told the truth. By early 1998, the reconstructed fuselage stretched nearly the full length of the hangar. Visitors who entered fell silent at the sight. The nose section, torn and blackened, rested in an upward angle. The tail assembly loomed behind like a monument. In between, gaps marked where the blast had torn the plane apart. Walking along that ghostly frame, investigators could trace the timeline of destruction in inches and seconds. It began in the center wing tank, frame 740 to be exact, and spread outward, shattering hydraulic lines and control cables. The nose separated almost instantly. The rest disintegrated as it fell. The NTSB's conclusion was not sensational. There was no villain, no terrorist plot, just a series of overlooked vulnerabilities that lined up in a fatal sequence. Old wiring, flammable vapors, heat, and time. The simplest combination imaginable, and yet one that had eluded engineers for decades. Still, the implications were profound. If Flight 800's wiring had ignited its fuel tank, then hundreds of aircraft still flying shared the same design. The realization sent shockwaves through the industry. Boeing and the FAA faced questions they weren't ready to answer. How many planes were ticking the same silent clock? By the end of that year, a quiet reform began. Airlines inspected fuel systems worldwide, replacing worn wires and rerouting circuits. Boeing engineers began to develop systems to inert fuel tanks, filling them with nitrogen-rich air to prevent combustion. It would take years for those safety changes to reach every plane, but the seed was planted here, in a hangar full of twisted aluminum and human grief. And as 1998 turned to 1999, the investigation was nearly complete. The missile rumors would fade slowly, but the mechanical truth would stand unshaken. What destroyed Flight 800 was not an act of war. It was a spark, a flicker of electricity, born of time and neglect, that ignited the night sky and changed aviation forever. By the time the final pieces of wreckage were lifted from the Atlantic, the sea had given up almost everything it had taken. Each fragment, pulled from the deep, told part of a story, one of metal, electricity, and tragedy. Barges anchored off Long Island worked around the clock, cranes groaning under the weight of twisted aluminum. Divers surfaced with small items clutched in their hands, a section of wiring, a passenger's watch, a page from a flight manual, still legible despite the salt water. For the men who recovered them, each find carried the same gravity. The ocean was no longer a resting place. It was an archive. Families of the victims began visiting the site. They came by boat, escorted by Coast Guard cutters, to lay flowers where Flight 800 had fallen. Some spoke softly to the waves. Others remained silent, gripping the railing, eyes fixed on the horizon. It was not just grief, it was disbelief. They wanted answers, and after 2 years of theories, silence, and rumor, the National Transportation Safety Board was finally ready to give them one. On August 23, 2000, after the longest investigation in the agency's history, the NTSB released its final report. The conclusion was precise, unemotional, and devastating in its simplicity. An explosion of the center wing fuel tank caused by ignition of the flammable fuel-air mixture inside. The ignition, they said, was most likely due to a short circuit outside the tank, which allowed electrical energy to enter through wiring associated with the fuel quantity indication system. The report did not name a person or a company. It named a process, a weakness built into an entire generation of aircraft. The findings drew a quiet shock from the world. For years, rumors had painted images of missiles and cover-ups. Instead, the truth was an invisible arc of electricity. No residual explosion, no enemy, no intent. Just electrons jumping across damaged insulation. One spark, and a jetliner disintegrated in mid-air. The technical language of the report could not mask the human weight behind it. 230 names, 230 families, and one question that haunted everyone. How had this been allowed to happen? In the days that followed, attention turned to prevention. The Federal Aviation Administration ordered airlines to inspect fuel systems on every 747 and other wide-body aircraft. Boeing engineers began developing systems to fill empty fuel tanks with inert gases to eliminate the risk of vapor ignition. Airlines adopted new maintenance protocols, replacing wiring bundles and adding improved insulation. Every safety directive, every engineering change carried the ghost of Flight 800 within it. But even as aviation advanced, controversy refused to die. A vocal minority continued to question the official findings. Independent researchers claimed radar anomalies still pointed to an external explosion. Some eyewitnesses insisted they had seen a missile's flare. Books and documentaries kept the debate alive, each arguing for a different truth. For the investigators who had spent years reconstructing the jet piece by piece, these theories were frustrating but inevitable. The reality of a single spark was too mundane for the human imagination to accept. We crave villains, not voltage. Inside the Calverton hangar, the reconstructed fuselage stood complete. Visitors described it as a haunting cathedral of metal. The nose section, where the blast had originated, was jagged and blackened, its windows gone, its aluminum curled like paper. Investigators had left it that way intentionally. It was a reminder of the violence of milliseconds. Some family members requested to walk beneath it one last time before it was dismantled. They placed photographs, letters, and flowers on the floor beneath the frame. For them, this was the closest they would ever come to the place where their loved ones spent their final moments. When the hangar finally closed, workers began taking apart the reconstruction, labeling each panel and storing it in crates. The sound of metal being unbolted echoed like slow applause, a final act of closure. Outside, a light rain fell on the runway where the parts would be loaded onto trucks. The investigation had ended, but the lessons would remain forever etched into aviation law, engineering design, and memory. In a small office at the NTSB headquarters, one of the lead investigators was asked by a journalist what he felt after 5 years of work. He paused for a long time before answering. He said, "You learn that airplanes are not just machines. They're stories written in metal." Flight 800's story was about the danger of what we don't see, the tiny things we overlook. Across the industry, engineers took that to heart. The tragedy of Flight 800 became a case study in system vulnerability. Training programs around the world began using it as a warning about complacency. Every spark, every wire, every seal mattered. No failure was too small. Years later, when new generations of aircraft rolled off assembly lines with nitrogen inerting systems and advanced fuel monitoring, a quiet line of text in the design paperwork paid tribute to that night in 1996. It simply read, "Safety requirement derived from TWA Flight 800." The flash that tore open the sky over Long Island had done more than destroy an airplane. It had forced an entire industry to look inward, to confront how progress and tragedy often share the same altitude. As the wreckage faded into storage and the Atlantic returned to calm, the story of Flight 800 stood as both warning and memorial. A spark inside a tank had become a lesson written in every checklist, every cockpit, and every new jet that took to the skies. The night sky had erupted. Aviation would make sure it never did again. The hangar may have closed, but the investigation never truly ended. For the engineers, scientists, and policymakers who studied the wreckage of Flight 800, the real work had only begun. What they discovered inside the twisted aluminum of that Boeing 747 was not just a one-off failure. It was a revelation that exposed a hidden danger running through the veins of nearly every jetliner in the sky. The culprit wasn't a weapon or a saboteur. It was electricity. At the National Transportation Safety Board Laboratory in Washington, the remains of Flight 800 systems were laid out like artifacts from another world. Bundles of wiring, charred connectors, and fragments of electrical panels. The investigators approached it with the precision of surgeons. Every piece had to tell its story. Under magnifying lamps, metallurgists examined scorched insulation, mapping microscopic burns that traced the path of current flow. They followed those paths like detectives, from wire to junction box to power bus. Somewhere along those lines, a spark had crossed a gap it was never meant to bridge. It was here that the scale of the problem became clear. The wiring that powered the aircraft's fuel sensors, the same system suspected of igniting the tank, had been in service for over 25 years. Back when the 747 was designed in the late 1960s, nobody had imagined those wires would still be in operation 3 decades later. Age and vibration had caused the insulation to flake away, exposing thin copper cores. In some areas, the wires had rubbed against metal brackets, leaving shiny grooves where sparks could jump. Boeing engineers arrived at the lab, joining NTSB analysts to study the damage firsthand. Together, they built detailed computer models of the 747's center wing tank and the electrical systems running beneath the cockpit floor. Simulations showed how a voltage surge in one circuit could couple into another through electromagnetic induction, a phenomenon invisible to the eye, but capable of transferring enough energy to ignite vapor. The result was an invisible lightning strike inside a sealed tank. To prove it, the team built full-scale test tanks. They filled them with Jet A fuel, heated the air inside to match conditions on Flight 800, and ran power through bundles of aged wiring. It didn't take long. In one test, a faint crackle echoed through the lab, then a muffled boom. The aluminum test tank spit along its seam. Inside, instruments recorded a peak pressure spike identical to what had been estimated from the real crash data. There it was, the spark that destroyed Flight 800, replicated in a controlled environment. For the investigators, it was both triumph and tragedy. They had found the cause, but it meant confronting a terrifying truth. Thousands of planes shared the same vulnerability. The world's fleet of Boeing 747s, 737s, 767s, and even older McDonnell Douglas and Airbus aircraft all used similar wiring configurations. Aging insulation, exposed conductors, and unshielded circuits were not isolated defects. They were systemic. The Federal Aviation Administration launched an immediate audit. Airlines were ordered to inspect wiring near fuel tanks, replace worn bundles, and add new protective sheathing. But the deeper fix was philosophical. For decades, aircraft had been designed with the assumption that electrical energy could be safely contained, that wires, once installed, would perform flawlessly forever. Flight 800 shattered that illusion. It proved that even a whisper of current, under the wrong conditions, could bring down a plane carrying hundreds of people. In private memos, some engineers called it the invisible enemy. Unlike structural fatigue or engine failure, wiring degradation offered no warning signs. It couldn't be seen during routine inspections unless entire sections of panels were removed, something rarely done in commercial maintenance. The industry had prioritized fuel safety, but not vapor safety. No one had asked what happened when electricity met empty space filled with fumes. The tragedy forced a new question into the heart of aircraft design. How do you make a tank full of fuel vapor impossible to ignite? The answer would change the way airliners breathed. Boeing began developing a fuel tank inerting system, a mechanism that filled empty tanks with nitrogen-enriched air, displacing oxygen so that even if a spark occurred, there would be nothing to burn. It was expensive, complicated, and revolutionary. The system had existed in military jets for years, but Flight 800 made it mandatory for the skies civilians traveled every day. In 2001, Boeing engineers conducted the first inerting prototype tests on a 747 at Seattle's Boeing Field. Watching from a glass observation room, NTSB representatives stood silent as engineers simulated the same electrical arc that had destroyed Flight 800. This time, nothing happened. No flame, no heat. The nitrogen had done its work. For the first time in 5 years, someone in the room exhaled audibly. The silence felt like victory. Still, those who had spent years among the wreckage knew there was no real celebration. The reforms came at the cost of lives, and every engineering drawing bore that weight. On the inside covers of NTSB reports, one sentence appeared in small print: safety recommendations derived from TWA Flight 800 investigation. But even as progress advanced, not everyone was ready to let go of the past. Outside the walls of the lab, skepticism remained strong. Radio shows still speculated about missiles. Online forums demanded declassification of radar tapes. The truth had become too technical for emotion to accept. Yet inside the world of engineers and investigators, there was no doubt. They had found the spark, studied it, and neutralized it. Flight 800's final legacy wasn't the flash that lit the sky. It was the silent promise that followed, that such a spark would never again be allowed to exist unseen. For those who had spent years untangling wires and tracing currents, the conclusion of the Flight 800 investigation brought neither celebration nor relief. It brought reflection and a quiet kind of grief. Behind every technical discovery lay a reminder of the human cost. The engineers who reconstructed that jetliner never forgot the faces of the families who had visited the hangar, who had asked them through tears not just what happened, but why. At Boeing's main engineering center in Seattle, that question became a permanent echo in every design meeting. Engineers who had once debated performance and efficiency now talked about insulation thickness and voltage thresholds. In training facilities, maintenance crews learned to listen for signs of wiring fatigue, a faint crackle, a brittle texture, a smell of scorched plastic. What had once been overlooked as minor wear now felt like a potential warning from the past. The tragedy changed the culture of aviation more deeply than any single accident before it. It forced the industry to confront an uncomfortable truth. Technology doesn't fail dramatically, it fails quietly. A single frayed wire, vibrating unseen behind a metal panel, could be the difference between flight and fire. Maintenance manuals were rewritten to emphasize inspection of aging aircraft systems. Airlines introduced new record-keeping for wiring integrity, ensuring that each circuit's lifespan could be tracked like that of an engine or hydraulic line. At the NTSB Training Academy, new investigators studied Flight 800 as a case study in humility. The lead instructor, a former field analyst from the case, began every lecture with a quote from his old notebook: "The enemy hides in routine." Students would sit silently as he projected an image of the 747's reconstructed frame on the wall, its jagged skeleton glowing under hangar lights. "This," he would say, "is what happens when we assume the smallest things are safe." The ripple effect extended far beyond engineering. Pilots, cabin crews, and dispatchers all began receiving new training in electrical anomaly recognition. Airline unions pushed for better funding of safety programs, and regulatory agencies began conducting unscheduled inspections of airline fleets around the world. The FAA launched what would become one of the most comprehensive rewiring campaigns in commercial aviation history, known as the Aging Aircraft Program. Meanwhile, the human stories never faded. Survivors' families became advocates for transparency in aviation safety. They lobbied Congress to increase funding for NTSB research and to make crash reports more accessible to the public. One mother, whose teenage daughter had been aboard Flight 800, later testified before the Senate, "We don't want revenge. We want progress. We want to know that no other parent will wait by a phone that never rings." Her words would later be quoted in aviation safety conferences around the world. In the engineering community, the emotional weight of Flight 800 lingered like static in the air. One electrical systems specialist recalled waking at night, haunted by the knowledge that it wasn't a failure of design, it was a failure of attention. Another investigator confessed that after 5 years of tracing a single spark, he could no longer look at a commercial jet without imagining the invisible network of wires pulsing beneath its skin. To them, every takeoff became a silent question: did we fix it all? The reforms sparked by Flight 800 began to reshape the future of flight. Boeing and Airbus collaborated with NASA and the FAA to standardize the nitrogen inerting system across all large commercial jets. The system, which replaced oxygen in empty fuel tanks with nitrogen-enriched air, proved so effective that it became mandatory for all new aircraft designs after 2008. The change was quiet, uncelebrated, a line of regulation buried deep within federal documentation. But to those who had lived through the investigation, it was a victory written in restraint. By the early 2000s, commercial aviation entered its safest era in history. Fatal accidents dropped dramatically. Passengers boarded planes without realizing that beneath their feet, silent systems were keeping them alive. Systems born from the fire over Long Island. The lesson of Flight 800 had become part of aviation's DNA. Redundancy wasn't enough. Prevention was everything. And yet, for the investigators who had lived through it, the scars remained. In interviews years later, some spoke about the quiet moments after the hangar lights went off, how they would stand alone beneath the skeletal frame of the reconstructed jet, staring at the place where it all began. One described it best: the hardest part wasn't finding the cause. It was knowing that such a small thing could carry so much tragedy. We built our world on the assumption that we understand electricity, but Flight 800 reminded us that nature always gets the final word.
In that reflection lay the heart of aviation's evolution. Progress doesn't come from confidence. It comes from fear remembered. And the spark inside Flight 800 had burned that lesson into history, ensuring that the next generation of airplanes would carry not only passengers, but memory. In the years following the official report on Flight 800, the echoes of that summer night rippled through every corner of the aviation world. The lessons learned from one tragic explosion became the foundation for a new era in aircraft design and safety. Yet behind every regulation, every redesign, there remained the quiet acknowledgement that this progress had been written in loss. Engineers, investigators, and pilots alike carried the memory of that falling fireball over Long Island as a reminder of what vigilance truly meant. The investigation's legacy began reshaping how airplanes were built long before the ink on the final report dried. Inside Boeing's headquarters in Seattle and across design offices in Toulouse, Hamburg, and Montreal, teams of engineers revisited wiring schematics that had gone unquestioned for decades. Every system, from lighting to fuel pumps, was now viewed through the lens of electrical integrity. They realized that wires, once thought of as passive, were as dynamic as any mechanical part. They aged, they flexed, they breathed with the aircraft, and if they were ignored, they could kill. The Federal Aviation Administration issued dozens of new airworthiness directives over the following years. Airlines were ordered to perform extensive aging wire inspections, mapping every bundle, every circuit path running through their fleets. Older aircraft were temporarily grounded until electrical integrity could be confirmed. For many maintenance teams, it was the first time they had been asked to look so deeply beneath the floorboards. What they found was sobering. Chafed wires, corroded connectors, electrical tape layered like scars. The ghosts of neglect had been hiding in plain sight. To coordinate the global response, an initiative known as the Enhanced Airworthiness Program for Airplane Systems was born. It brought together manufacturers, regulators, and airlines under one goal: to make electrical safety as central to flight as aerodynamics or propulsion. Training modules were rewritten to teach engineers how to read the story of a wire, identifying subtle signs of fatigue invisible to the untrained eye. One engineer who had worked on the TWA 800 reconstruction described it simply: "We stopped thinking of wiring as plumbing and started thinking of it as life support." The influence of Flight 800 spread even further than aviation. Industries that relied on high-voltage electrical systems, submarines, spacecraft, and nuclear facilities adopted similar inspection protocols. The NASA Safety Board, still scarred by its own tragedies with Challenger and Columbia, incorporated findings from the TWA 800 investigation into its electrical safety models. The concept of latent failure became a universal term, the idea that disasters are not caused by single mistakes, but by chains of invisible weaknesses waiting for alignment. Meanwhile, Boeing continued its pursuit of the ultimate safeguard, the inerting system. By the mid-2000s, the Nitrogen Generation System, or NGS, had become standard on every new aircraft. The system worked quietly, producing nitrogen-enriched air that filled the space above liquid fuel, suffocating potential ignition sources. To passengers boarding planes in the 21st century, it was just another invisible layer of safety. But for the engineers who had lived through Flight 800, it was a monument, a silent memorial in motion at 35,000 feet. Yet progress was never purely technical. The emotional aftermath of Flight 800 continued to shape the culture of investigation itself. The NTSB, having endured years of media scrutiny and political pressure, restructured its communication strategy. They began releasing findings to the public with greater transparency, inviting families to briefings before the press. Every future crash report would carry a clearer voice, factual, detailed, and deeply human. No longer would investigators be faceless analysts. They became the storytellers of safety. For the families, healing came slowly. Many turned their grief into purpose. They formed advocacy groups pushing for stronger oversight in aircraft maintenance, and some became guest speakers at aviation safety conferences. Their presence ensured that every statistic had a name. When Boeing engineers began testing new inerting systems, they invited a small group of these families to observe. As the tests concluded, without explosion, without flame, one mother wept quietly and whispered, "They finally listened." Flight 800 also altered how investigators approached future disasters. When Swissair Flight 111 crashed in 1998 and Alaska Airlines Flight 210 fell into the Pacific 2 years later, the same analytical discipline from Flight 800 guided those inquiries. The wiring insulation in Swissair's cockpit, the jack screw in its tail assembly, all were examined with the precision born from TWA's lessons. Each new tragedy carried forward the knowledge purchased by the last. Over time, aviation entered an era of near-perfect safety. Fatal accidents became rarer, and electrical fires nearly vanished. Statistically, flying was now safer than walking across a busy street. But in the NTSB's headquarters, where fragments of old wreckage still rested in glass cases, the memory of Flight 800 never faded. Investigators would often pause before the scorched piece of fuselage labeled Center Wing Tank Section 2A, the place where the spark had begun. For them, it wasn't an exhibit. It was a reminder of their promise. As one NTSB director later reflected, Flight 800 was the day aviation learned humility. It taught us that safety isn't a finish line, it's a moving horizon. Every wire, every checklist, every maintenance note is a chance to keep that horizon just out of reach. The spark that once ignited tragedy had now ignited transformation. And from the darkness of that summer night rose an unspoken truth that would guide the industry forever. Progress in flight is never built on triumph. It's built on remembrance.
Decades have passed since that night, yet the name TWA 800 still drifts like a whisper across the aviation world, not in fear, but in reverence. It is no longer just the story of an explosion in the sky. It is the story of how an industry faced its own reflection, how a tragedy became a turning point, and how human determination turned loss into legacy. At Calverton, Long Island, where the reconstruction once stood, the hangar is now silent. The massive steel ribs that once framed the reassembled fuselage were dismantled, and the parts that once defined a mystery were finally laid to rest. In 2021, the wreckage was respectfully destroyed, not forgotten, but released. Investigators, many of them now retired, gathered to watch as the fragments of aluminum that had once haunted them were lowered into furnaces for recycling. Some took small pieces of wiring insulation, sealed them in glass, and kept them on their desks, not as trophies, but as promises. One engineer said quietly, "This isn't the end of evidence, it's the beginning of peace." The lessons learned from Flight 800 remain alive in every plane that takes off today. The whisper of nitrogen flowing into a fuel tank, the flicker of sensors checking insulation resistance, the meticulous checklists reviewed before every flight, each one carries a trace of that investigation. Modern aviation thrives not because it has forgotten fear, but because it remembers it every single day. When pilots step into their cockpits, surrounded by digital displays and automated systems, they inherit decades of progress built on that tragedy. The cockpit voice recorders now capture not just words, but tones, stress levels, silence patterns, because the Flight 800 investigation taught the world that truth hides in sound as much as in steel. The black boxes became more than tools of blame. They became instruments of evolution. In the NTSB archives, the final report on Flight 800 rests under controlled temperature and light, its pages slightly yellowed, the ink crisp. Within its 400 pages lies the blueprint for a safer world. Diagrams, circuit maps, lab photos, and a closing statement that feels less like bureaucracy and more like an oath. The probable cause of this accident was an explosion of the center wing fuel tank, resulting from ignition of flammable fuel-air mixture by an electrical fault. Contributing to the accident were deficiencies in the design, maintenance, and inspection of wiring systems. For the families, that statement was both an answer and a wound. Many had spent years fighting for recognition, some believing in missiles, others in conspiracy, but nearly all united by the desire for accountability. With time, the truth, as complex and technical as it was, became the only path to healing. Memorials were built in their children's names, scholarships founded for aviation students, and foundations created to support safety research. Grief transformed into momentum, ensuring that every passenger who boarded a plane afterward did so under the protection of their memory. The Flight 800 Memorial in Smith Point County Park, overlooking the Atlantic where the plane fell, stands as a quiet sentinel of remembrance. Etched in stone are the names of 230 souls, arranged in a gentle arc facing the sea. Families visit each year on July 17th, leaving flowers, folded notes, and photographs. As the waves break softly against the shore, some close their eyes and listen. There's no sound of engines, no flash of light, only the wind, the same wind that once carried Flight 800 into the night sky. The investigators who stood beneath the wreckage now teach the next generation of engineers and pilots. They tell them the story not as tragedy, but as transformation. One instructor, addressing a room full of aviation students, puts it simply: "You don't honor the dead by fearing the skies. You honor them by understanding what keeps us there." And that understanding continues to evolve. The systems designed after Flight 800 now protect spacecraft, electric vehicles, and even deep-sea submersibles. What began as an inquiry into one spark became the foundation for global standards in wiring safety and fuel inerting. The ripples of that night now touch technologies far beyond aviation. Every spark-proofed connector, every shielded circuit, every thermal cutoff switch owes something to that investigation. In the end, Flight 800's story became bigger than itself. It became the story of human persistence, of scientists who refused to settle for guesses, of families who refused to accept silence, and of an industry that learned to face its mistakes without turning away. The flames that once consumed the Atlantic were not the end of flight. They were the light by which the future would see. When the sun sets over Long Island and the ocean glows orange beneath it, pilots crossing the eastern seaboard often look down, their instruments steady, their cabins quiet. They may not know the coordinates below hold the memory of one of aviation's darkest nights, but in the hum of engines, in the rhythm of safety checks, in the pulse of circuits that no longer spark, the legacy of Flight 800 endures, invisible, eternal, and alive in every safe landing that follows. The fire that once consumed the sky now burns in another form, a quiet, relentless fire of knowledge. It is the flame that lights the path of every engineer, every pilot, every passenger who believes in the miracle of flight. And that flame, born from tragedy, will never go out.